How's it going, everyone? Welcome, here again. Yesterday, we look at how can we now have this funny behavior, especially when you are running component tests, and those component tests actually are deeply coupling or tightly coupling to the Redux store, right? This is state management that actually where we can now put this app level states as a way to now consume from there and render the elements that we need, right? So the example was something very trivial but fairly common, right? Let me actually now move on to that. Wait, what? Why not? Why not? Okay. There you got it. Okay. There you got it. Let me actually run this and npm star. Okay, there you got it. Right, so the issue was that because this particular component packaging list, and if we inspect these elements here, all right, with our component, and we say, hey, what this component is this packaging list, all right? Especially with this kind of components, when we need to provide some data, in this case, from the state management, that we are actually memoing this kind of data. So for example, the store and the description, as well as the items and layout effect, okay? The thing here is that, well, this is actually part of the Redux API that exposed to us, similar to the subscriptions and get server state and all that kind of stuff. But the thing here is that this provider, okay, or this particular state allows to have access to this set of elements here, right? So whether it is a collections of items here, in this case, we say, hey, title here, this is pack and unpack. So anytime we wanted to add some new elements to this, for example, let's say iPhone 15, right? And then we add that, and then we add another iPhone element to this. As you can see, we are not only adding this element to this state, all right? But when it comes to actually test this, things started to get quite interesting. Why is that? Because since we need to test our entire component as well as the Redux layer, that tightly coupled, that's when things started to get a little bit complicated in terms of testing. Because when you want to test your component, right, you also need to actually decoupling is the user interface from the business logic. And this is a big issue in a lot of this kind of UI development, not only for React, but also for Vue. Is like how you can now decouple this kind of stuff so you can run now tests is only on the relevant components. And that is when we apply this particular pattern, which is, hey, let's going to abstract this provider uh, into its own component, okay? And then the component itself is going to actually be testable. So what do I mean by that? So instead of having this particular architecture, and you have the packaging list and the provider, right? So what we're gonna do is to have now the provider on top of the packaging list, and we can export this packaging list to test this as a UI component, and also the need to actually is create a new state or a new provider for that, for our tests, right? And this is something interesting because if we didn't do this, we wouldn't be able to find is these particular errors that happen, right? Errors in terms of mocking or running our applications or testing our components multiple times, because this test, even though each one of those tests run in isolation, because they are tightly coupled into that component, that Redux store, it ends up that our tests are not in isolating state. So we need to make a way to actually do that. So how can we do that, right? Well, pretty straightforward. Follow me along here with the code. I think it's this one. This. So because we have this particular component that actually it makes sense in terms of wrapping this component as needed. Okay, so hey, this component actually from this moment on, we're gonna make use of this store. So this section of the React component tree, from this point, we're gonna make use. So all of the children components have access to this. They are under the umbrella of this state. So, okay, let's go to the case. Let's go to the cheese. Well, because especially here, one of the errors that we get here was by the time we run our tests, okay, is that especially if you run your tests, and this is something true, especially if you run your tests when you are rendering several elements and you are testing several of these components to be added to the element, to be added to the DOM or remove. Well, here's what we're gonna do, right? This is our move. Let's go into define here is say in this case the name actually doesn't matter, but we can say is we can take some inspiration from other code bases here, like the okay, job stable row. My question is that where do we use for example, this is notification in center dialog, trigger, pop over. That's right, notification center, route detail, well table, vendor profile, and then map, build locations, marker, calculation locations. Oh, but this is calculating here. And dispatch. What about the admin here? Oh, in forms, because most likely forms actually make use of this. Or they say, hey, you know what? Let's going to put all of our in one file. On the util, wrapper mock, right? Exactly. On the test, you can create a file to actually wrapper them under the utility and that kind of thing. But the whole point is to use this or to define these functions to wrap this functionality, so we can now have not only a way to test this component, but also a wrapper around this. So, yep. So this might be an alternative. This definitely might be an alternative. Yep. This might be definitely an alternative for that. And in each one of them, you create now a mock for that. Yeah, make mock store, which is just creating a new configure store. Make store. So, but for our case, okay, but for our case, because this is a pattern, where we are, yep, because this is a pattern that gonna repeat itself, we can now define this, whether it's on a particular file under the test, or in this case, in this particular component, but we're gonna say, hey, this will be now the application, okay, and these applications, it'll be now a function that is going to now wrap the provider here, return the provider, okay, similar to this, all right, and this is when we need to actually provide this store, but this store, right, is something that we need to create that by the scratch. So we need to create a new instance of this store. That's what happened.
I'm going to use this as an excuse to kind of like think about the architecture here a little bit. And what the first thing I want to do is like separate Redux stuff as a rather. Yeah, that's in the right direction. Like your closure state. At this point, like it wouldn't show me any items. I have a bunch of other weird stuff. You would also have a version you could export as well with the default and the named export. I'm using export default because it's very common with React applications. I tend to my own adjust our test a little bit. At this point, we're going to get the cool. So we've got that in place, and like I haven't solved the issue yet because the export still put in the default one. And if I just try to grab the packing list, we'll get a new error. Let's go view the new error because I think it's worthwhile.
Yep. So what we're doing here is just to find a way to abstract that the provider is say, hey, missing some children components. No, what you can do is to say, hey, whether is or passing the packaging list. Okay, say, hey, passing the packaging list as a way to test this component, or you can create now your own general wrapper function, all right, that instead of doing this, you're gonna now require to pass it as props. So for this case, we use this because this is a very specific wrapper where we can create all of our tests. And as you can imagine, this can be quite tedious and verbose to actually, anytime we want us to test a particular component, you don't want to do that, right?
So let's go and we'll adjust our test a little bit. At this point, we're going to get the uniquely exported one, which blows up lots of my tests, all of them, for those keeping track at home, which is like, hey, you tried to use dispatch, but you don't have a provider. You're like, that is true. I do not have a provider. So we got that. Could we like export the provider? We could, but you know what I'm going to recreate at that point? My original problem, right? Because then I will still have one with the store in closure state, and I will just be back where I started with a slightly more modular component, like better than when I started, but with the same issue.
Exactly. So now you are representing your own. You are representing your own problem here, and it's because you need to find a way to import this. Yeah, you need to find a way to import. Oh, come on. What the fuck wrong with you, man? Chill, chill. Easy, easy, easy. All right. Yeah, what you definitely now is to when you are trying to access to that closure state.
Use dispatch, but you don't have a provider. You're like, that is true. I do not have a provider. So we got that. Could we like export the provider? We could. So you know what I'm going to recreate at that point? My original problem. Right, because then I will still have one with the store in closure state, and I will just be back where I started with a slightly more modular component, like better than when I started, but with the same issue. So let's not deal with that journalist yet. So one of the cool things about React testing library is that you can, I could do something where
Yeah, one of the great things of the testing library here is that you can wrap this component here into its own.
provider. So we need to deal with that somehow. And this just comes down to regular JavaScript in this case, where it would be nice to be able to like create the store, give myself the ability to do that. So let's go in here and say,
Give myself the ability to do that in the fly.
one store to rule them all, use it, it's in closure state,
Mm-hmm. This is this particular store, right? You have one store in a closure state, use it. And when they say that closure state, is because it creates now a closure. This store, which is part of the Redux API, and Redux API at the end of the day is like a monad. I'm not going to dive deep into that. But these monads, in terms of functionality, allows to describe is state change. It's a way to model is state change. So in any case, here we are now with Confused Store, right? To create now a store, we are creating is this new brand store. Okay. You can create this, but you then need to get all of your reducer.
What I could do on the other hand is I could say store, create application store, whatever this we have is. This is a function. Export.
which is pretty similar to what we did here, of what they're doing here. In terms of creating their own wrapper here, right? And now pass that as a store. When they say make mock store, preload state is store, preload state is now load state, which is a function that they define here to actually is get that state from that. Interesting. This is when you can define is your preload state. All right, that's interesting. You can define your preload state, and then you say, hey, now let's going to add this to our. Okay, and then you say, no, this will be a new store from that. Make mock store.
Now I have the ability to get a fresh store, and I have like one that's available for the store. Right? I have not lost anything. I only gained, and I gained a lot for what is formatted to be 4 lines. Right?
Well, yeah. Again, you are doing this, and it's because when you want to run your tests, specifically lists or forms or any other component that need to access to these third-party libraries, in this case Redux, right, as a way to now query states and dispatch actions. So we need to find a way is to actually one, decouple this kind of tests. Why? Because especially when you are running multiple or when you want to test when you want to test use cases that your users will experience in real life applications, a lot of the time those components now interact with the store. So the problem comes when you want this to actually now create a new state in any test. So when you want to actually so when you want to create a new test, or when you wanna run your testing isolations, create a new test. This is the problem here. This is the problem here. Okay, that is this, because most code bases are starting to falling apart through a relatively series of, and again, I'm just memorizing this or trying to understand this. So most code bases start to falling apart through a relatively series of reasonable hacks and shortcuts, but they are reasonable hack and shortcuts, things to get the job done. But over time, it adds up and ends up into a point where you don't trust anything there. That's not viable. That's not sustainable, right? So how can we do that? How can we now actually do something that we have, where our tests actually provide this confidence that. So how can we reach to a state where we continuously? So when we continuous, how can we move forward? And this is the how to. Interesting. We're looking for how to's. In this context here, this how to, which is interesting. But the thing here is that once we are running our component tests, that the main value of this, so the main value is we can get the where the main value is we can get the the main value of this component test is that we continuously so the main value of this is that continuously making sure that everything, continuously make sure that things don't break behind our back. So in the case of component UI, in the case of component testing, is the idea that we're gonna get some confidence that in our UI development, things work as expected when we deploy that to productions, when real users use this. So when real users hammer into your app. And this is something that you can imagine you can apply that to any other fields, even though, for example, for your fridge or your bike or your motorcycle, or even for yourself, your oral fits, you need to define some sort of practice in terms of make sure that that thing actually works as expected. So you continuously making sure that things won't or things don't break behind your back. Now, as we creating our component testing using testing library, which is a great thing, okay, which is now offer a nice little wrapper around your DOM or the your UI component, whether it is on React, Angular, Svelte, Vue, right? So they provide this nice little wrapper, pretty much like React, that is now a nice little wrapper around the DOM that allows you to compose all of this user interface. For the testing library, it's pretty much like that. It allows you to now query elements as well as expose some of the most common user interactions. So for example, like click or typing or keyword, right? So for example, key up. So how do you simulate a key up? You need to first press key down and then key up. This is just a couple examples that this testing library is offered to us. And the whole idea here is that for any startup, when you want to sell this application, you can sell them with this, right? It's like, hey, this is the reason. Take a look. This is what we did, and there you got it, right? So this is now the most common user interaction that you can go with, right? So for example, pointer, keyword, clipboards, and other utility APIs, right? So for example, type on an input or upload, you know. But the whole idea is this. And all of this are running into a Node.js instance that implement the DOM. So why is this? Because instead of actually get a full browser-driven integration, which can be quite cost, and most of the time we don't own, or the company doesn't own a lot of the things, a lot of the infrastructure there. So for example, hey, where this browser is going to be run, in which OS is going to be run, Windows, Mac, or Linux, or which browser are we going to simulate, or in which browser we're going to run our tests. So Firefox, Chrome, Safari, or any of these hipster browsers like Brave. So the idea, and not to mention, is the network connectivity. So hey, is the user now coming from a 2G or 3G or 4G or recently now a 5G? Okay, so all of this nuance, well, the component tester is trying to say, hey, let's go to improve the confidence in our UI development. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. So by putting all of these tests, so we look at how can we do this, which is a great thing, completely, and using this testing library, this nice little wrapper, and as we testing not only small components, for example, counter and that kind of stuff, but also is more complex React applications, right? Such as rendering a list of elements. And when this list of elements gets rendered, uh, most of the time we need to access to this app level data through a store, which is using now Redux, which is in a closer state. So, so now this is starting to make our tests quite challenging, because we need to test this component, but this component is tightly coupling is with some business logic or for some other components. So the way of how can we solve this is, from the architecture perspective, is to, well, now isolate that component. In our case, as you can see here, is to isolate that component. Okay, so is to isolate the component. So instead of using now the provider here in this component, is to say, hey, let's go to put now this component, all right, or let's go to put now the providers at some point in your application. Usually we put that at the entry point, okay, usually, but it's going to depend on your use case, right? Yeah, it's going to depend on your use case, but we usually put that there. Let me see here, the components, what is this? Is the store, the query, services, pages. Okay, so in the pages, usually we put all of this on top of that. So this is the entry point for, this is another application here, but the thing here is that all of this, we usually put them at the application level, right? We put all of these providers, all of these producers of data at the top, at the entry point, right? That might be quite good, depending on the use case. But usually when we put your root state, your app state, okay, you might not want to, you might want to do that or not. It's gonna depend on your application. Not to mention the context as a way to prevent this prop drilling. So instead of actually now passing the data, instead of to prevent props drilling, we want is to actually define the entry point or React DOM. All right, let's say something further down to our React DOM, and place the provider there, so all of the chain component can have access to this. One of the trade-off of that is that when the value of the provider change, it will now re-render all of the components down below. That's when you need to evaluate when you're going to put this context, so forth and so on. And there are also some optimization techniques. So for example, like use memo or use callback, where you can say, hey, let me now to catch this computation in the case of use memo, or callback in the case of functions reference. So if they don't change, well, we're not gonna call it. We don't during the rendering process. So it's quite interesting, by the way. It's very, very, very interesting. So, but for our case, okay, in our program here, most of the time this provider stuff actually gonna live is on the entry point. Where is this? This is the store. No, on the entry point. Exactly. Most of the time this store we're gonna live is now at the entry point like this, right? We can also make this much more modular by saying more reusable by saying, hey, whatever children that you're gonna receive here, no, but this is the type you're importing, is it? Exactly. And I don't want the, you know, whatever children you are receiving here in this application, because at the end of the day, this is what you're gonna get from this React component. All right. You might say, hey, um, hmm. Okay. Okay. So here we can say is that, hey, I want to now pass is the children here. But it's a, you can get these props with children, right? So you are now assuming that you're gonna get this React node from the application, and wherever React node that you get in here, I want you to render this here, right? So, well, because here on the entry point of our application, right? Exactly on the entry point of our application, which is the index. We want us to now render is all of this component as expected. So the question will be is that how you can do this.
And I gained a lot for what is one part. Let's do some. If I really wanted to, like, I could use children here to say this out, which would then make it so I could then the naming. And so let's return. This will be the one wrapped in state management. Not going to put this break. Now I've got just a pure React component. If I really wanted to, like, I could use children here to say this out, which would then make it so I could render this component stuff. But like I could begin to further break apart this component and make it a little bit more modular, that. But I've started by at least separating out the part wrapping
So because this is the entry point, right? And here you can say, uh, at least let me actually is render this component, right? Uh, which is the packaging list. All right. So I want to render is this component, and again, this is a very simple component here, one single page. There is no router involved and all that kind of wildness. So I want to now export is the application here instead of the packaging list, and also export that. So why I make this? Because also you can say, hey, I would like to now render is a children component that are gonna pass to this to make our test much more modular. What does it mean by that? You know?
So then I could say like application. If I really wanted to, like I could use children here to take these lists out, which would then make it so I could render these components but like I could begin further breaking apart this component and make it a little bit more optional for children to understand that. But I've started by at least separating.
Mm-hmm. The React Children pattern. Mm. Mm. Mm-hmm. No, exactly. It's the React render pattern here. But again, mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, the React render pattern here. Okay. It's actually to pass down data, so on and so forth. Especially if you want to pass now elements to that. Especially if you want to pass now elements to that, where in the list section is going to render all of this component as it is from the packaging list, right? And then it will have some other problems here that are not relevant to this case, right? But we can now assume that is that. Okay. But again, this is to get more flexible components, which is a great thing. All right, you want to get this more reusable components. But for our case, we don't want that, right? At least for this kind of level, we don't want that. We can just wrap this packaging list as a way to access, to accept some of the children component, which means that to pass down now children's React component, okay, and render them, which is I get it. I totally get it by saying it's like, hey, here we're gonna now is receive is the children here, okay, and then now in the packaging list I will say, hey, we would like to now to on the packaging list, I would like to now at this level is render these components, all right, as a way to make this much more modular like that. Extract the children component from props with children, all right, and then in this way this will change this to provider. I don't know who told you that. uh, and in this, stop doing that, stop doing that, stop doing what you think it. No, oh my god. Okay. Hmm. Oh Jesus. Okay. There you go. Okay. So this is a way of how you can now replicate this children pattern to say, hey, at the padding element, you're gonna pass all of these elements, and at the child component is gonna render all of the elements that I'm receiving here, right? This will work, right? So if you take a look now at the application here, you render this. So this actually works. So don't take my word for granted. Let's actually take a look at that here, right? That actually work here in this case. New item, the kind of thing that you can actually add some items here and say, hey, MacBook Pro, right? Or the iPhone. So you can see it's actually working as expected. So no problem at all in that, right? So, but this is not relevant for us. Oh, okay. So this children component pattern is a way to actually pass down data similar to slot. Okay, similar to slot. So that's very interesting. Very, 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 very interesting. Uh, yep, it's very, very interesting, by the way. Totally, absolutely. Um, and not only that, this is the way of, this is in Vue you have something called slot. Within this slot you define is the child components that we want to make use of that. Okay, and the child component that you want to make use, you define that inside of that slot, all right, and then you can put a name to that in the Vue way of rendering this components dynamically, pretty much like the HTML does, by passing all of these elements and then rendering, all right. That pattern, that vSlope pattern, is not the children props pattern. Interesting. All right, makes a ton of sense. All right, uh, yeah, let's going to keep these things as it is. But what happens is that if you want to render these kind of components here, right? You will in fact need to change a little bit your tests, because you need to actually now wrap your packaging list with this set of items here, you know, because when you're gonna run your tests now, by the time you will run your tests, like you think you're doing. So by the time you run your test here, oh really? I want to run my test, man. There you go. By the time we run our test, where in this case is the item list, packaging list is this one, is a packaging list dot test dot tsx. All right, so by the time we run our test, it says, hey, it failed, right? However, it actually passed all of our tests, which is a great thing, especially if you take a look now at the packaging list test when we define all of this. So we don't have to define any component inside of this, okay? It's actually render those elements properly, all right? At least when it comes to adding the elements there. And package links, MacBook Pro, and all that kind of wireless, right? So this is when we're going to actually do this, right? So yeah, but again, the TLDR of all of this is that we abstract now is the application, or we abstract now the providers into the application in this particular app, and the relevant component now is going to consume that. In the case of the new items and the item list, okay, they're going to consume that. For example, in the case of item list, they are going to consume that very strictly forward, right? And it's going to export that, export packaging list. Okay, this is quite interesting that my test actually
out
failed.
the part wrapped in the provider from the part that's not. So then I could say like application will be the thing with default, and then we'll also export the packing list, because this is what I said before, like having a version wrapped in all the state management is great for when you use it, and then like if you ever just wanted the raw pieces of UI and be able to like pass that in place and like have, which blows up lots. Let's go view the new error because I think it's worthwhile. So let's go and we'll adjust our test a little bit. At this point we're going to get the
interesting. Our test didn't blow up, but let's go to adapt our test here with packaging list to actually see this particular error. And of course all of them fail, okay, all of them fail, and it say, hey, it tells me, hey, couldn't find the React Redux context value. Please sure the component is there. Hey, use this patch, you don't have that. And I say, yeah, I get it. So here is when we started to use now this nice little tool from testing library that allows us to wrap a component here with the providers. Okay.
Uniquely exported one, which blows up lots of my tests, all of them, for those keeping track at home, which is like, hey, you tried to use dispatch, but you don't have a provider. And you're like, that is true. I do not have a provider. You know, so we've got that. Could we like export the provider? We could, but you know what I'm going to recreate at that point? My original problem. Right, because then I will still have one with the store enclosure state, and I will just be back where I started with a slightly more modular component, like better than when I started, but with the same issue. So let's not deal with that just yet. So one of the cool things about React testing library is
that allows that provide us this.
I can even.
Is that it provides us this particular render wrapper.
Like wrap it, like I can pull out a provider, I can wrap each one. Now again, like the store is my issue, not the provider. So I need to deal with that somehow. And this just comes down to regular old JavaScript in this case, where it would be nice to be able to like create a store and give myself the ability to do that on the fly. So let's go in here and let's say in our store, we are just making one and exporting it. There's one store to rule them all. Use it, it's in closure state, you don't have a choice.
There is one store to rule them all. Use it. It is in a closure state. You don't have no choice.
What would be better? And could I grab configure store? I totally could, but then I'd have to grab like the reducer, and I'd have to whip this together for every test and throughout my application. What I could do, on the other hand, is I could say.
Exactly. You generate this new one, and I understand now the pattern from the children.
This is a function now. That we export. And now I have the ability to get a fresh store, and I have like one that is available for use through my app, right? I have not lost anything, I have only gained, and I gained a lot for what is formatted to be 4 lines of code, right, and not a ton of characters.
But again, all of this is because
so we have that
the
in
way
this
how we
case,
are
and that's
architecting
super
our
helpful.
application.
So now what we could do is we can pull that into our test.
Mm-hmm.
I
So
feel
we
like
can
naming
create
stuff
our
is really
store
hard,
and
then
then
like
wrap
IntelliSense
that with the
made it harder
provider.
because I don't want to use like really common reasonable names anymore because like autocomplete is really nice. So we could go ahead and let's say for instance we're going to use this test right now as an only test because if it passes we know at least we have a path forward. I don't need to watch all 7 fail all the time.
We can use
or for
it
different reasons.
say only.
All
right. And then I want to now
cool.
wrap
fails,
this.
The same reason
And I want to
before,
wrap this is because
so we could say
in our index store, we can say,
provider,
hey, I want you to now
provider.
create store,
in this case,
okay, which will be now a function,
provider, and then for the store,
right, that is going to return is this new store, okay. And I want
now we've got it passes. We've got a fresh store.
this.
I'm very lazy. I don't want to do this 7 times because I didn't even write all the tests.
And
there's
we
all
can
sorts
only
I can edit
just
one. I can
call
do all sorts
create
of stuff.
store.
I'm very
for
lazy.
that.
I don't want to wrap
Right.
everyone in a.
So we gain here is the
just yet.
modularity
What I would
from
probably
the
do in this case
function,
is,
which
I
is
could do something
quite interesting. Okay, and this is one of the reasons why functional programmers are actually focused on functions, because now you are going to make your life much more easy to test and debug this particular functionality here, right? So by creating this function here, you can now export this, but this is very specific to this. You can now export this function to create your store, not only when the application is mounted, but also for your tests. And this is the value of this. This is the value proposition of doing this. Hey, I'm gonna create now a function that is available for different environments here. And by the time that I want to run my test, okay, I can use now the provider here, okay, like this, and on the store to say, hey, I want to now is create store, create store, which is something that you're gonna export from that, all right, and I would like to call this a store, okay. So you're gonna create now a new store from the scratch, a new object here, in this case, disclosure state of the Redux, that is going to maintain our application. But the point of this is that I'm creating here is this function that is going to, it's like a factory. So what we're doing here is just following is the factory creational pattern. You have now, this is how you're going to produce this new object here, part of the creational pattern. So here we say, hey, this is our store, all right, and anytime we render this file, this will be our store, and this will be now our packaging list. So far so good. So now if we save this, we're going to say create store. From the create store, it says create store is not a function. Wait, what? I'm not exporting that? Oh, it's because I'm not exporting that. Now it does. And as you can see, actually good. We are creating, so we are now abstracting from the component is the provider, okay, into their own. But this is something interesting, especially when you need to handle this states here. So if a component is inside of a provider or a context, right? The best thing that you can do is this test provider pattern. So put that provider into another function this is something powerful here. So put this provider into another function and wrap it with the components, and leave the components without any provider. This is a pattern. This is a pattern that is done over and over and over and over. Yeah, this is not something new, by the way. You know, this is not something new. So now our test runs, okay? But as you can imagine, if you do this for all of your provider here, it can become quite tedious. So one thing what we can do is to say, all right, I would like now to create is a wrapper here with this provider, okay? And I'm gonna export that. So how can we do this? Well, I would like to define this render function, okay? Okay, this render function here as this, where you say, hey, this render function is gonna accept now the UI, all right? Pretty much like the render function that we're importing here. We're gonna accept the UI element, all right, which is a React dot React element, okay. And here, what I'm gonna do is to now get this render method from the abstraction that I made for our test that contain the query methods and the most common user interactions provided by the testing library. So anytime we need to actually mount a component, whatever component it is, so we can have access to this function that has everything that it needs to. We just only pass what is required. And also we can make use of the options if it's needed. So we can say, hey, I would like to also pass the options here if you want to, right? And say something like this. So for example, we can say is parameters, which is parameters. Hey, this TypeScript utility function, please give me the type of give me the type of give me the type of render option, but in this case is the parameter of the render component, okay? Render component the parameter of render component, okay? Render component one. You may wonder, what is this render component, right? This render component should come from the should come from this render option. From our text utility, render option, yes, which come from the render component, which is from the render. Oh, I get it. Okay. So give me now is from the type the render here. You say render option here. is this one. You say, hey, render, there you got it. But in this case, as private render. So give me the type of this parameter for the second position. So option now suddenly becomes is option is declared but it's valid read. So now this actually becomes is that particular parameter, which is 1. But again, this because this render here I'm reading is the second parameter, which is the options here. So as we can move as we move here, we can say, hey, now I want to is inside of this is to create a store here, all right, and then I want to provide that. We say, hey, let me return, right, is the render here with this piece of information, this piece of data, right, which is a great thing, okay, and one of the great things of this, right, or instead of doing this, you say, hey, you know what, I would like to now here is pass the UI, right? You say, hey, this will be the UI, and I want to render is this here, right? So you say, hey, what I would like you to pass is the UI, for example. Or you can only say something like this. So packaging list. All right. So it's going to return now this render object. We want to now render that UI component as it is. Or where you can say here is yeah, I wanna provide you this render with the UI. Let's see how can we do this.
We'll do UI render. Like if this took props, and I want this prop, this one here. This should just work at this point. Let's see what we got. I had a real issue and I had a render. And now if I look, that one renders. Let's see. This should just work at this point. Let's see what we got. I had a real issue and I had a dumb issue. Let's deal with the dumb issue first and get it out of the way, and then we'll finish up with the real issue. The real issue should be solved at this point, but the dumb issue got in the way. I made a big deal before about you can put in emojis in a name and the role will strip out the emojis. That is still true. Not true for labels, right? Which are just actually matching the test. So I have two options
Exactly,
here.
not true for labels.
And honestly, they both go into what you should probably have in your test is a little more flexibility. Like you want when your tests break, you want them to break for a really good reason, not because someone put an emoji in the UI. Because like next time the designer goes on PTO, I'm going to put some emoji in the UI. And the test shouldn't break, or maybe they should, right? Depends on like the spiritual version of that. So I can either use a regex, or I could use the fact that emojis are stripped out and still be case sensitive. At this point, it's working with the case insensitive regex. I think that's totally fine. But yeah, it also shows that like you want your test to break because your functionality doesn't work, not because of like a tiny implementation detail like an emoji. In this part, we are whipping up a brand new store.
To create that
I did kind of change it a little bit as I was playing around.
Exactly, because here when the time you're creating is this, okay, with the UI and the options here, So because we are receiving is this as it is, the create store is this, but we need to actually create a wrapper for this. So what is this wrapper? This wrapper will be now a function that we're gonna pass down that data. You see what is here? So this, because we hit the problem here is that we need to pass this, but as a children component, as a children component. Because here we want is to render this data. So this children component, that is something that we're gonna receive for children, okay, from our component here. From our component here, right? In this case, children. But it say, hey, I don't recognize this. What do you mean by children? Chill, don't panic. Props with children, which is, after all, this is a React component. Okay. And this not only is gonna return this. Okay. So you're not only gonna return this, all right? So you're not going to return that, okay? The GSX, but we exactly, we're not only gonna return that, but we also need to call the render function here. Because this component here, it say, hey, this is now the wrapper component. Okay, this is our wrapper component that by the time, and in this case, we're going to receive the children as it is, as expected, exactly. So by the time we receive is this user element, and we create the wrapper where we're going to pass now all of our components dynamically, we say, hey, let's go to return now here this render object that will be is the UI that we pass to this. All right, so far so good. The component itself, in this case, yeah, the component itself, and there is a particular property here that is the wrapper, where you can say, hey, this will be is the wrapper here, or let's put this here as it is, wrapper. So wrapper, okay. And by the time you actually call this render, you say, okay, I accept, okay, whatever option you pass to this, followed by the wrapper, right? So by the time I call this and say, hey, this is packaging list, this particular component that I want you to render, all right? And if I run this, it actually works as expected, right? But all of this is just because we are not creating wrappers around wrappers for our components that needs a provider, right? So this is something that you, as you can imagine, that you're gonna create that for all of your components, okay? And then you can put that into the utility functions, and you can call this is render with props or render with provider. Okay, you can do some refactoring here and say, hey, okay, hey, I would like to now is render. I wanna do some refactors. Go to implementations. Go to definition. Do it. Okay, final reference. and the Alt and Shift. Okay, you can say this. All right. But what if I want to refactor this? Or okay, rename symbol. Exactly. Rename symbol. We say render with provider. Right? And anytime you actually have that, you automatically do that for us. So okay.
And separating stuff out slightly, which is I make the store as a variable. I have this ability to wrap it in a provider, right, which is just the child at this point. The really cool thing you saw me typing earlier is that React testing library will, if you're using the same wrapper all the time and you don't want to, like, let's say like this is one provider. Let's say I had like, you know that thing where you start out with like one context provider, especially if you're using the context API, and next thing you know you have 7 of them, right? Like, say I had like, you know that thing where you start out with like one context provider, especially if you're using the context API, and next thing you know you have 7 of them, right? Like, could you have put them in over and over and over again? Sure. One of the things I would probably put in the utilities is like either wrapper or like something called like all the providers, right? And then this wrapper option will then take your component and wrap it in that entire hierarchy, so you don't ever really have to see that. But the kind of core piece, to kind of summarize, is my tests were failing because of a problem with my architecture. My problem with my architecture was that my state manager.
Exactly. My tests were failing is because my problematic is, in this case, so you can do this, and so at this point, my tests were failing is because I have an architecture problem here, and that is these tightly coupling communications. Okay, between the UI and the state management here. So this is something that can happen a lot of the time when you're testing stuff, right? And remember, the thing that when you started to, things started to falling apart, the moment that you started to do some hacks, to get just to get the job done, and then you suddenly realize in the long run that you can't trust any of your tests, so you just throw that away.
And my UI were tightly bound to each other, right? And made it difficult to actually use this component, and that manifested itself in the tests. Like I said, this is a small example. Stuff like that.
And it is interesting because that manifests is on the tests. So this manifest is on the test. When you run this, and we are looking here at the how to create this test, this component test, using the testing library, not only for the React components, but also it's for the nuance with React components. And especially when you have now a test, and this is somewhat similar to unit testing. Hey, I just want to run this test, and only that. And if in that particular test or in that particular function you have side effects, of course, that's when things started to get quite annoying. Then. So how you can do that is by following this principle of functional programming. For example, a function purity is that, hey, given the same input, return the same output, right? Same input, same output, and this is just to mention that. So so your function should not, most likely, is do some side effects, and when they do, for example, in the case of a component, because at some point they need to communicate to somebody else, whether it's a local store or a network request or another model here, in this case, the state management, an animation, all right? And when they do, well, in the context of React components, pretty much like in unit tests, you abstract that problematic stuff here. and you focus is on that. So you abstract that problematic stuff, which is in our case the provider. You abstract that. You now, instead of mock that, you just create a new instance for that. That's something that's more compelling. That's way more much compelling than mocking something. So you create now a new instance of the problematic stuff anytime you run your tests.
This has manifested itself in reality, but at that point it's so like ingrained, and because I don't have the tests sometimes to catch these things early, it's very, very hard to refactor, and then it just becomes like, I guess this is us now. I guess this is how we live. And separating out. The other thing, and I'm not going to do this all the way because like we're already in the weeds a little bit, and I don't want to be too React specific at this moment, that I would think about doing, just kind of like some food for thought for later, is like I said, it still has to be wrapped in some kind of provider because you can't take props. So things that I might choose to do later on.
So, but these two problems that we have here that our tests show was the architecture, okay, how we build this, how we build our UI and the state management, okay. We have this architectural problem, and now with the DOM here, because what it is enables the add enable button to do this. And it adds, oh, this is because we have now, yeah, enables the add button here and all of this kind of thing, right? But once we do this, all right, get labeled by text, and get labeled by text actually works great, because this is another test that they have there. You know, it puts on another test here, and not only that, is continuously failed, because as you can see here, it say now, look at this, packaging list, new item label, right? Add new item, and here we don't have is that MacBook Pro element here, right? So anytime we create a new one, which is quite interesting, all right, it say, hey, adds a new item to the unpack list or unpack item list when they click in add new item. So here we want to check is now if this here, okay. So this is the unpackaged item element. And as you can see, we type MacBook Pro, we add it, okay, but in this case, this has not been added. Screen.get labeled by, it say, hey, there is no MacBook Pro at this moment, so it means that I need to wait for this. Should I wait for this? So instead of putting the iBook Mac here, because the problem here is it's telling me that by the time it say we're able to find a label with the text of MacBook Pro. So it didn't add that label to this, but we don't have now duplicate tests. As you can see now, we run our tests in isolation, which is one of the problems that we had to run this test in isolation, to actually now anytime we render this with the providers, now creates a new instance for that. But it say, hey, when you say, hey, this is the input, right? Screen.get by label text. Using this particular function, we can get is now the element. All right, say new item here. We can get is the input. But as you can see, look at this. Oh, okay. This is quite interesting exercise. This is very interesting because what happened here is that we are here in our component, we are not following is the format that make this actually that make this work. How is that? Because anytime you want to get an input by a label, there's some rules that you must do. There's some rules that you must follow, which is on the packaging list. On the packaging list here. Okay, on the packaging list, on the new item here, because our labels does not match in this case with the packaging list here, get by label text new item name, in this case is actually match, so we're actually getting that. All right, but by the time we add something here, in this case, hey, get roll by button and add new items. Okay, this is our button here with the roll here, right? And by the time we actually click on that, render with provider, right? It say, hey, I couldn't click that, so I click that, but I couldn't find anything related to this, right? Get labeled by text. Which is quite weird, because you're supposed to get that. This is screen, get by label, and say, hey, I couldn't find that. Okay, I couldn't find that. But this is if you want to remove that. This is if you want to now add this. So screen get label text by MacBook Pro. Get by label text, the new item as it is. And then you got is this MacBook Pro. MacBook Pro for here, they say to be not checked. Okay, so this is quite interesting, because by the time we now add new item button here, add new button, add new item, it's pretty much descriptive here. With the 12 here, you say, hey, let me rename this, add new button. Okay, it's pretty much descriptive. It say, hey, I don't find that element there. And the only thing that we changed here was this. But look at this now, it actually showing this. It's because by the time we create that, okay, now I get it. I get it. Now I get it. I get it. Okay, so this is when our test fails. But it failed because we are not providing it with a particularly proper. You know, you just stay there. So in this case, right, we were able to add those elements there, right? We could add those elements there. Is in fact the element is in there. But if you change this to this and say, hey, I'm going to show these elements here, right? Because now here in the packaging list you're passing is this children element, all right? A very interesting thing here, it is, what is this doing? Screen.debug of the document. You know, what is this doing? Packaging list, and then in there actually the element was created, which is a great thing. No, the element was not created, bro. New item, the element was not created here. Dynamically, the element was not created here. Okay. The element was not created here. And here is exposing is our architecture. This is exposing our architecture, right? This is exposing our architecture. So by the time we are rendering is this, okay, and we're passing is the packaging list, all right, we're supposed to pass also some elements to this, Okay. We're supposed to pass some elements to this. Interesting. In the item, no, we're supposed to pass these elements here. Instead of passing them dynamically. So it means that this, we need to actually even is mimic this behavior. That's what happened. So that's what happened here. But if you do this, what happens is that when you call this packaging list, you also need to recreate the semi conditions for this. So recreating the same condition means that it's not feasible. Like, okay. So this recreation of condition when you're creating your component is something that is not desired, right? Is a behavior that is truly not desired. It might be great for, unless you wrap this packaging list with that in your test, all right? So let's say, so in this case you say, okay, you're gonna render this as it is, but you need to recreate this. That's what happened. You will need to recreate that in your component here. So by the time you pass now this packaging list, you also need, for example, in this case, let me actually do this here. With, for example, here. So by the time you need to recreate this, you also need to recreate that here. And of course, import the element here, the item list. Okay, import the item list to see that now you are in fact adding that. You see, you are now, by the time you click here, you actually is now adding that element. Of course, this is not the way how you can find this, okay? Because get by level text needs to, it's gonna match that to see if that exists. And instead of doing that, you can say is it say, hey, I couldn't find any of these elements that you mentioned here because they don't follow. However, as you can see here, we could add that element properly here. Okay, this is a very the devil is on the detail here. So instead of actually passing this, so anytime you're gonna render, okay, this is good. Anytime you wanna render is component in this way, all right, with the children and all that kind of stuff, for okay, for testing, it is much better that that component has everything that it needs. For testing, it'll make much more sense that that component has everything that it needs to. It'll make a lot of sense to that component has everything that it needs to. Right? That's why we are actually having this. So by the time we want to say, hey, I want to now check that, not by get label, okay? Because unfortunately I won't be able to find that and say, hey, get by label text in this particular method. Actually find elements here is with this get by element method here. on the core API get by. Show me here is the options, advanced timer, pointer, keyboard, clipboard, utility API, convenience, it's the introductions, like this, frameworks, React, the API. By the time I get this, no, but this is for them, the core APIs. Do you have anything that is, well, about queries here? Okay. So for example, if I want to say, hey, get by, throw an error, return here. It's not, okay. Query by, find by, get all. In this get by, return a matching node of a query and throw a descriptive error if no elements match or if more than one match is found. Okay, so query options, screen, text match. So get by text, exactly this case is like that. It's like instead of get by label text, that this is what it's gonna do is to check if the label and the input follow that particular format, HTML4 and the ID. But in case we don't care about that, we care is that label exists. Get by text, okay. And it say, hey, I couldn't find anything like that, you know, despite that is there. MacBook Pro, you say get by text, right? Or you can use this regular expression. By saying is, hey, I want to now do this, right? And try to find that element, and now it find it, right? You say, hey, there you got it. So now, add the new items to the unpackaged item list when clicking add new item. Alright, so this is the unpackaged list, okay? And here, what it says is, well, I would like to check if this to be in the document, right? So I expect that to be in the document, which is as expected. That's it is. No, in this case, we are doing is the debug here, right? And you can see we added this element to MacBook Pro as expected, right? So this is now, look at this. This is two problems that we have in our tests, right? So architecture and DOM problems and how to fix it. You know, React applications and DOM and how to fix it. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.